In 1863, a soldier heading to this front might travel farther in 1 week than his grandparents had in their entire lives. Not on foot. Not on horseback. But on a rattling train, packed with hundreds of strangers, rolling toward a battlefield he'd never heard of called Chickamauga. I'm riding Amtrak's Crescent into Atlanta, in air conditioning, with a coffee and a reclining seat. He had smoke, dust, and splinters for cushions. And yet, in a strange way, we're on the same journey. In late summer 1863, thousands of soldiers boarded trains in the east. They changed cars, changed railroads, and slept sitting up as they rattled through the Carolinas and Georgia, all to reach one place, the rail hub of Chattanooga. For some, it was the first time they'd ever left their home county. The landscape outside the car windows might as well have been another planet. One of those men is the person we're going to follow, a young private I'm going to call Thomas. Thomas crowds onto a wooden bench. The car smells like sweat, tobacco, and damp wool. Cinders from the locomotive drift back through open windows, burning his skin and settling into his eyes. When the train stops, townspeople bring baskets of food and wave flags. When it starts again, the smoke rolls in and the cheering fades away into clatter and darkness. For Thomas, this isn't just a ride. The railroad is a promise that he'll get to the front fast, that his sacrifice will matter, that his side can move men and guns as quickly as the other. Every new junction, every change of cars, is a reminder that this is bigger than his regiment. By the time Thomas reaches Atlanta, the railroad will have turned this small junction into the beating heart of a total war. The whole war is being squeezed onto these rails, so much so that, before long, whole corps will be riding them for days at a time, from Virginia to Tennessee and back again. All across the South, tracks led here. Chattanooga was the crossroads, rails north to Nashville, south to Atlanta, east toward the mountains and Virginia, west toward the Mississippi Valley. Control this city, and you control how food, ammunition, and reinforcements flow across the Deep South. Thomas doesn't see that whole network on a map. He just feels the train slow, the orders shouted, the sudden hush when someone whispers, "Chattanooga." A few days after stepping down from those cars, Thomas will walk into one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The same rails that made his journey possible will also make the killing bigger, faster, and harder to escape. In a conflict still fought mostly on foot and horseback, the railroad turns a quiet stretch of woods into a slaughterhouse. Today, it feels peaceful. You can hike under those trees and hear nothing but wind and birds. But if you listen closely, the story hiding under that silence isn't just about generals and maps. It's about Thomas and men like him jammed into rail cars, dozing against each other's shoulders, wondering where this line is taking them, and whether they'll ever ride it home. I'm going to follow Thomas's journey as closely as I can. From this modern passenger car into Atlanta, along the old Western and Atlantic corridor, up to Chickamauga and the rail hub that so many men fought and starved over. Chattanooga, not just to show how the rails shaped the war, but to ask what it felt like for Thomas to live and fight in a world suddenly moving at the speed of steam. Chattanooga arrival. When Thomas's train finally slows, it isn't rolling into a big city. In 1860, Chattanooga is a town of only a few thousand people. A tight knot of streets between the river and the hills, with church steeples, brick warehouses, and a few new depots crowding the tracks. Why would armies bleed for a town this small? What Thomas can't see from the platform is that this little knot is already one of the South's key rail junctions, a place that both sides have had circled on their maps since the war began. To Thomas, after days of forests and small stations, it still feels enormous. The rails have been here longer than most of the faces he sees on the platform. Before the war, trains came to Chattanooga with cotton bales, barrels of flour, pig iron, and timber, and they left with passengers headed for riverboats, Atlanta, Nashville, or Memphis. This was a place where people changed cars and changed directions, not a place where whole armies were supposed to pass through. As Thomas leans out the car window, he can smell the river and coal smoke mixing in the morning air. He watches porters and railroad men dart between cars, hears conductors calling out connections, and catches glimpses of townspeople who can't quite decide whether to stare at the soldiers or pretend nothing has changed. Some are clearly used to the sight of uniforms. Others hold children closer and step back from the edge of the platform. Nobody explains the map to Thomas. He doesn't see the lines radiating away from this little town, north toward Nashville, south toward Atlanta, east toward the mountain passes, west toward the Mississippi Valley. What he sees are switches, sidings, and a tangle of tracks that mean one thing. This place matters enough for the railroad to come here from every direction. Older railroad men in sweat-stained shirts move with a practiced rhythm, coupling and uncoupling cars like they've been doing this for years. For them, the war is a new, dangerous customer layered on top of the old business of hauling freight and people. They used to worry about schedules and broken couplers. Now they worry about cavalry raids and bridges being burned out from under their trains. For Thomas, the surprise isn't that there's a town at the end of the line. It's how unprepared that town feels for the scale of what's arriving. The depots were built for travelers with trunks and carpet bags, not for endless strings of boxcars loaded with ammunition, crates of hardtack, and more men than the local streets have ever seen at once. As he steps down onto the platform, boots hitting planks slick with coal dust, he can't tell who's truly ready for what's coming. Shopkeepers peer from doorways, trying to guess whether the war is just passing through or settling in. Families scan the faces pouring off the cars, hoping to spot a husband, a brother, a son, or dreading that they might not. Thomas doesn't know whether he'll be defending this little river town or trying to take it. He only knows that the railroad has delivered him to a crossroads where someone, very soon, is going to fight over which trains get to leave and which ones never will. To Chickamauga. When Thomas's train pulls out of Chattanooga, the town still doesn't look like a battlefield. The river moves at its own slow pace, children chase each other between wagons, and church bells ring over the noise of locomotives. If you didn't know better, you might think the war was somewhere else entirely. Today I'm riding the Crescent into Atlanta. A century and a half ago, Thomas rode this same north-south rail spine in a wooden boxcar instead of a coach seat. Out my window I see subdivisions and highways. Out his, it was farms, depots, and hills that were about to become a front line. The cars he's climbing into aren't meant for comfort. They're freight cars, boxcars, and open gondolas swept out in a hurry, planks laid down for benches. Men hoist themselves up by grab irons, rifles and bedrolls banging against the sides, boots slipping on coal dust. This modern schedule board is the descendant of Thomas's timetable. My Crescent follows the corridor his old Western and Atlantic trains helped carve across the Deep South, even if the rails and the locomotives have changed. As Thomas's train jolts forward, Chattanooga begins to slide past. He sees stacks of lumber, piles of rails, and rows of freight cars on sidings. Silent reminders that this town used to be about shipping goods, not shuttling armies. Now every siding is crowded with war. Ammunition cars, hospital cars, cars full of horses that scream when the brakes grab too hard. As my train rolls past these hills, I'm shadowing Thomas's route. Different tracks, different locomotives, but the same rail axis that linked Chattanooga and Atlanta to the wider war. At the edge of town, the houses thin out and the hills close in. The line twists into cuts and over small trestles, following the folds of the land south toward Georgia. From the doorway, Thomas can see the Tennessee hills rolling away, and he wonders how many people out there ever imagined their quiet valleys would become a highway for war. The farther they get from Chattanooga, the fewer civilians he sees. Stations that once served travelers now host clusters of soldiers and a few weary station agents, ink-stained hands juggling orders that all sound the same. Move more men, more supplies, move them faster. Sometimes his train slows to a crawl while another load of troops grinds past, faces blurring together in the smoke. I step off into quiet platforms. Thomas stepped off into a war. The rails beneath both of us trace back to the same 19th century routes that made this corridor worth fighting over. Nobody tells Thomas exactly where Chickamauga is. They speak of it as a direction, not a dot on a map. Down the line, toward the river, out near the fields and woods. To him, the front isn't a single place yet. It's a feeling that grows stronger with every mile. More guns in the cars, more ammunition stacked by the sidings, more officers riding with folded maps and tight jaws. By the time lanterns flicker on in the cars, Thomas understands one thing very clearly. Back in Chattanooga, the railroad felt like a promise of movement, of power, of control. Out here, rolling toward Chickamauga, it feels more like a one-way road. He doesn't know it yet, but the same rails that are carrying him forward will soon be jammed with men trying desperately to ride them back. When the train finally shudders to a stop, Thomas doesn't arrive in a grand station. It's little more than a platform and a siding, some rough planks, a small depot building, a water tank leaning over the tracks. The name board could be any small stop in Georgia, but the number of uniforms says otherwise. He climbs down into dust and cinders. The ground trembles as another locomotive eases past, brakes squealing, cars packed with more men just like him. Orders crackle around him. Companies, regiments, directions shouted in accents from far-off states. There's a strange mix of hurry and confusion. Quartermasters are trying to sort crates and barrels into neat stacks, while officers try to sort men into neat lines. Neither job is going well. The railroad has done what it does best: deliver more people and stuff than the little station was ever built to handle. Thomas shoulders his gear and steps aside to let a stretcher crew through. A man lies there, gray with dust, bandage stained through at the shoulder. The battle hasn't even properly started here, and yet the line is already carrying wounded back the way he came. Proof that the war is closer than any map ever made it look. As he moves away from the cars, the sound of the trains doesn't fade. It just blends into the rest of the noise. Axes in the distance, felling trees. Wagons grinding down dirt tracks. The clink of entrenching tools as men start to dig, even before they know exactly where they'll be told to stand and fight. The landscape itself feels off balance. Fields that should be full of late-season crops are cluttered with tents and stacked muskets. Fence rails are disappearing into campfires and breastworks. Farm lanes are turning into military roads, rutted by thousands of boots and wheels. If Thomas looks back toward the tracks, he can see more smoke on the horizon, more trains coming. Every puff on the skyline means another regiment, another battery, another reason this patch of woods and fields is about to become important to people who never knew it existed last month. No one says second bloodiest battle of the war. No one says Chattanooga campaign or turning point. Around Thomas, the talk is simpler. Where to find water, how far the march will be, whether anyone has word from home. The big story exists only in the way the railroad keeps bringing men here faster than they can be moved away. He adjusts his pack and joins the column forming up along a country road that suddenly feels much too narrow. Behind him, the locomotive gives a last hiss of steam and starts to back away, already making room for the next train. Thomas has the uneasy sense that he's just stepped off the safest thing he's likely to stand on for a while. Somewhere ahead, through the trees and over the low ridges, the name Chickamauga waits for him. Right now it's just a word passed from mouth to mouth along the line. By the time he sees these tracks again, if he sees them again, it will mean something very different. Thomas doesn't see the whole battle. No one on the line does. From where he stands, Chickamauga is a strip of woods, a crooked fence, and a smoky field that refuses to stop swallowing men. The first hours feel like every other hard day he's had in the army. He loads, fires, and bites another cartridge. He can't see much through the powder smoke, just shapes moving in the trees, flashes of color where flags jump up or fall, officers on horseback appearing and vanishing like ghosts. The sounds do more to tell the story than the view does. On his left, the fire is steady and sharp, a long saw cutting back and forth. On his right, it's ragged, flaring up and dying down as units drift and stumble in the undergrowth. Somewhere behind him, artillery thumps away like a slow heartbeat. At first, the orders are confident and clear. Dress on the colors. Hold this line. Wait for the word. Thomas does what he's told. Shuffle a few steps. Close a gap where a man has gone down. Fire into a wall of trees that seems to be firing back. Then the little things start to feel wrong. Couriers ride up and argue in low voices with the officers. Men come drifting in from the flank, panting, saying they can't find their regiment, that the line isn't where it's supposed to be. The fire on one side grows distant, then suddenly closer than it should be. The woods blur into a maze. A unit that should be on Thomas's right isn't there anymore. In its place, there's a gap where the forest seems strangely quiet. And then, all at once, shouting and musket flashes much too close, at a strange angle, like a door flying open in the wrong wall. He realizes the line isn't a straight line anymore. It's bowing, buckling, folding in on itself. Men who were facing forward a moment ago are now turning sideways, or back, trying to guess where the danger really is. Thomas hears someone yelling that they're being flanked. Another voice shouts that it's a mistake, to hold fast, that no one is to fall back without orders. In the noise, it's impossible to tell who outranks whom, or which voice belongs to the man who's actually in charge. He keeps firing because that's the only thing that still makes sense. Ram, aim, squeeze, recoil. The routine is a thin rope in a river that's starting to run too fast. Then the rope starts to fray. Men to his left begin edging backward between the trees, one step at a time, still firing over their shoulders. On his right, a group breaks and runs outright, heads down, packs bouncing. In the spaces they leave, the woods suddenly look very empty. For a moment, Thomas feels almost alone. The smoke thins, and through it he can see shapes moving in the distance. Lines where there shouldn't be lines, flags where there shouldn't be flags. It hits him that the battle isn't something happening out there anymore. It's folding in around him like water closing over a stone. Someone finally gives the order he's been half expecting, half dreading. Fall back! Fall back to the next line! The words are barely out before the whole front seems to heave backward at once. Thomas doesn't remember deciding to move. One moment he's braced behind a tree, the next he's stumbling away from it, trying not to turn his back completely, tripping over roots and bodies and dropped equipment. The air feels suddenly full of things, shouting, splinters, the hiss of rounds cutting through leaves. In that scramble, the railroad flashes through his mind. Stations and sidings. The safe, straight logic of tracks and timetables. Out here, there's nothing straight about anything. The neat lines they marched in on have dissolved into knots and streams of men, all trying to find a way that isn't directly into the teeth of whatever is pushing them back. He has no idea that this confusion, this sense of the ground giving way under his feet, is being repeated up and down miles of forest. He only knows that the order has changed. Yesterday, the rails brought him toward Chickamauga. Now every instinct he has is pulling him back toward those same tracks, if he can live long enough to reach them. What happens when rails make it too easy to get into a slaughterhouse, and too hard to get out? When the shooting finally slackens, Thomas realizes the noise hasn't really stopped. It's just changed. The crack of rifles and roar of artillery give way to something thinner and harder to ignore. Shouting, groaning, and the low, steady murmur of men who hurt too much to stay quiet and are too tired to scream. He moves through a patch of woods that looked solid before the fight. Now it's a maze of splintered branches, torn ground, and bodies. Some men lie very still, faces already oddly calm. Others are half sitting against trees, bandages pressed to their sides or their heads, eyes staring at nothing in particular. A boy he vaguely recognizes from the train ride in is propped against a stump, jacket cut away from his shoulder. The sleeve of his shirt is soaked through, fingers twitching around the edge of the bandage. When he sees Thomas, he tries to joke, asks if the train's heading back to Chattanooga anytime soon. But the words fall apart halfway through, and they both pretend not to notice. Near a shallow ravine, soldiers have started to gather the wounded in clusters. There's no neat line, no clear system. Just groups of men lying on blankets, on coats, on bare ground. Someone has set a canteen down between two of them, and they take turns nudging it toward each other with shaking hands because neither one can quite lift it. Thomas hears snatches of stories as he passes. A man explaining, almost apologetically, that he never saw who hit him, that it must have been a stray round. Another describing how an entire company seemed to vanish when the line broke. He keeps naming friends, waiting for someone to say they've seen one, anyone, since the smoke closed in. No one answers. Not far away, a line of stretchers is forming, or at least trying to. Pieces of canvas, doors ripped off hinges, fence rails lashed together with straps. The men carrying them move slowly, boots slipping in mud that isn't all mud. Every few yards they have to stop, catch their breath, and decide who looks worst off along the path. One man lies on the ground with his boot off, staring at what's left of his foot like it belongs to someone else. He asks Thomas if he thinks they'll put him on a train or a wagon. Before Thomas can answer, the man says he doesn't care which, as long as it's away from here. He keeps repeating that, away from here, as if distance itself were a kind of medicine. The dead don't tell stories, but other men tell them anyway. Over a fallen fence, Thomas hears two soldiers arguing softly about a friend who went missing in the confusion. One insists he saw him go down near a certain tree. They talk in circles, as if saying his name enough times might make him step out of the shadows. Every now and then, someone calls for silence so an officer can read out a list names of those known to be alive, known to be wounded, known to be dead. The silence never lasts. As soon as the list ends, men start filling in the gaps themselves. He was next to me when we charged. He went down near the fence. He said he'd catch up, nobody's seen him since. Thomas realizes how many of his own stories now have missing pieces. The man who shared his coffee on the train that morning. The one who complained about the cinders in his eyes. The one who swore he'd never be scared as long as the rails behind them were still open. He looks around and can't match all the memories to faces anymore. The officers will later write numbers: killed, wounded, missing. On the ground, it doesn't feel like numbers. It feels like empty spaces in the ranks. Bedrolls that won't be unrolled tonight. Familiar voices gone quiet. Every stretcher that passes Thomas is a sentence with no clear ending yet. As dusk settles over the trees, the battlefield starts to split into two different worlds. In one, men like Thomas are still on their feet, stacking ammunition, shifting positions, waiting for whatever comes next. In the other, just a few yards away, the wounded lie in growing darkness, counting the minutes by the sound of wheels wagons creaking toward the rear, maybe, or with luck, toward the tracks. Thomas finds himself listening for that sound more than any other. Every distant rumble could be a train that will carry some of these men toward hospitals, toward towns, toward something that isn't the shattered forest. For those who can't walk, the railroad has become the thin line between hurt and left behind. He doesn't know yet how many thousands the official reports will list, or which side historians will call the winner. What he knows is that when the head count comes, it will never quite match what he saw. There will always be a few stories like the ones he's hearing now half finished, trailing off into the night, carried only in the memories of whoever lived long enough to walk back toward the rails. Retreat to Chattanooga. When the order to fall back finally sticks, Thomas doesn't head for a station sign. He follows boots, wagon ruts, and shouted directions, north and west, toward the only place anyone still mentions as secure, Chattanooga. The march doesn't feel like a neat retreat so much as a long, uneven exhale. Some men move fast, as if distance alone could erase what just happened in the woods. Others drift, looking back over their shoulders, half expecting the tree line itself to start firing again. Every now and then, someone stops to adjust a bandage on a friend and then has to jog to catch up. The roads were never built for this many people and this much fear. Wagons choke the narrow tracks, wheels cutting deep into soft ground, mules balking at mud and noise. Ambulances, when they can be found, jolt along with their own grim cargo, drivers standing up in the traces to shout men out of the way. Now and then Thomas sees someone simply step off the road and sit down, as if the weight of their gear and their thoughts has finally become too much. What used to be the simple math of distance now feels more complicated. On the way in, the rails made the miles disappear, stations flickering past in hours. On the way out, every mile has to be earned with sore feet and frayed nerves. Thomas starts measuring the day not by the sun, but by how often he hears the distant, comforting note of a whistle somewhere ahead. As the days blur together, rumors move faster than the columns. Stories about trains loaded with wounded leaving from hidden sidings. Stories about bridges blown to slow any pursuit or to keep the enemy from using their own lifeline against them. Stories about Chattanooga filling up, running out, getting ready for a fight of its own. Late one afternoon, he crests a low rise and finally sees it again, the faint outline of steeples, smokestacks, and the shimmer of water beyond. Chattanooga. The town that once looked to him like an end-of-the-line station now looks more like a bowl, cupped by hills that feel closer than they did before he saw them on a map. The closer he gets, the more crowded everything becomes. Wagons that limped away from Chickamauga now cluster on the approaches to town, waiting for orders that never seem to come fast enough. Cattle and mules are herded through streets already jammed with soldiers, civilians pressed into doorways to stay out of the way. Someone has set up a triage point by the side of the road? Thomas walks past men laid out in rows, waiting for a place on a wagon or, with luck, a train car. The railroad announces itself before he sees the depot. Coal smoke hangs over the low part of town. The hiss and clank of engines idle under all the other noise. Men shouting, horses snorting, barrels being rolled, crates being dropped. For a moment, Thomas feels the same flicker of hope he felt on his first arrival. The sense that as long as the trains are moving, there's still a way out, or a way forward. Up close, the hope looks thinner. Sidings are crammed with cars, some loaded, some half unloaded, some simply abandoned where the last crew ran out of time or orders. Railway men with rolled-up sleeves move faster than anyone else, trying to make sense of conflicting demands. Get the wounded out, get the ammunition in, get the food wherever it's needed most. Every delay feels dangerous, as if the hills ringing the town are listening. Thomas edges along a platform slick with coal dust and mud, watching a line of wounded being helped into a string of boxcars. There are no seats inside, just straw, blankets, and whatever padding could be found. One man leans against the doorframe and looks back toward the road they all came in on, as if he can still see the battlefield from here. When he catches Thomas's eye, he gives a small, tired nod. The kind of nod that says, "You made it," and "I'm not sure what that means" at the same time. The town itself feels caught between normal and something else. Laundry still hangs from a few balconies. Church bells still ring. But shop windows are boarded, doorways are crowded with families trying to decide whether to stay or go, and every open space seems to be filling with stacked crates, piled muskets, and men waiting for orders. As night falls, the rails glow faintly in the lamplight, stretching out of town into the dark. To Thomas, they no longer look like a simple way home or deeper into the south. They look like lines drawn on a map that someone else is fighting over. Lines that might mean rescue if they stay open or hunger and surrender if they're cut. He finds a place to sit near the yard, back against a crate, boots finally off. Somewhere behind him, a locomotive gives a long, low whistle and starts to move. Wheels scraping against rails that have already carried more men than this little town was ever meant to hold. Thomas closes his eyes and listens, knowing that for now, at least he's made it back to the next station on the line. Even if he has no idea what kind of fight is coming there next. Siege plus Lookout Missionary Ridge. When the gates of Chattanooga close behind Thomas, it doesn't feel like safety for long. At first, it's a relief, solid streets under his boots. Brick walls instead of trees, rails, and riverboats close at hand. But as the days pass, the town starts to feel less like a refuge and more like a lid being pressed down. The hills around Chattanooga, which once framed the town like a picture, become a problem. Rumors say the enemy is on those heights, watching the streets, counting the wagons, sighting in on any train that dares move in daylight. If the rails and the roads are the army's veins, those ridges are fingers closing into a fist. Thomas notices the change first in the food. Can a rail town survive when the hills around it turn into a noose? Rations that were skimpy before Chickamauga get thinner. Bread stretches farther, meat shows up less often. And coffee, the thing that kept half the army upright, becomes something you hear about more than you taste. Men start to talk about cracker as if it were its own food group. The railroad yard tells its own version of the story. Engines that used to come and go now sit cold more often, lined up like beasts waiting for a signal that doesn't come. Cars stand half-loaded, as if someone couldn't quite decide whether to send them out or keep them here. Every time a whistle blows, heads turn automatically. It might mean supplies got through, or that another train is being pulled further back out of danger. Nights grow louder and quieter at the same time. Louder, because wagons move under cover of darkness, teams strain to drag loads along roads that are watched during the day. Quieter, because men on the lines peer into the dark, listening for any sound that might mean the ring around the town has tightened another notch. Thomas spends long hours near the riverfront, where the water and the rails come closest together. Boats sit low in the water, waiting to see if any run up or down the line will be allowed through. Once in a while, someone points upriver and talks about a lifeline. About the effort to pry open a route of boats, wagons, and short stretches of track that might connect them back to the world. Later, people will call it the cracker line, the shaky supply vein that keeps Chattanooga from starving outright, one barrel of hardtack at a time. He doesn't know the name anyone will later give that route. What he knows is that every time a wagon rumbles into town with hardtack barrels and coffee, the mood shifts. Shoulders straighten. Voices get a little louder. For a few hours at least, the fear that Chattanooga is becoming a trap eases. Then the rations thin again, and the talk comes back. About bridges blown up the line. About trains held miles away because the risk is too great. About how long an army can stay in a town if the rails and roads feeding it are pinched shut. From a rise near the edge of town, Thomas can see the tracks fanning out and then disappearing into the hills. They look the way they always have. Cold steel, wooden ties. A clear path through rough country. But now he understands that they're only useful if someone still controls the far end of the line. Inside Chattanooga, the war feels like a siege of numbers. How many days of food? How many serviceable wagons? How many cars of ammunition still in reach? For Thomas, it becomes simpler than that. He wakes up each morning and checks 3 things. His cartridge box, his canteen, and the faint smudge of smoke on the horizon that tells him whether the rails and river are still, somehow, open. For weeks, Chattanooga feels like a question mark. Then slowly, the mood shifts. It begins in small ways. A few more wagons coming in, a little more coffee in the cups. A rumor that the river road and those patched-together tracks, the cracker line, are finally working. Men stop talking as much about being trapped and start talking about how long they can hold. Men start using the word line differently. It's not just the railroad line now. It's a thin, fragile path running along water, road, and track that might keep Chattanooga alive. From town, Thomas sees more smoke on the hills. At first, it's hard to tell what it means. Then one morning, the distant sound of guns rolls down from the heights, and the talk in the streets changes. No one is asking if there will be a fight anymore. They're asking where and when and who will still be standing in this little crossroads when it's over. Lookout Mountain looms over Chattanooga like a stone wall with its head in the clouds. To Thomas, it has always felt less like a battlefield and more like a backdrop. But now he hears that men are climbing it under fire, fighting in mist and rock and scrub. From down below, all he can see is smoke drifting around the cliffs, but he knows that if those heights change hands, the town's fate changes with them. Missionary Ridge is closer and more personal. He can see its long spine from the streets. Trenches dug into the slopes, guns in place to watch the town and the rails. When the day comes, the sound of the fighting there doesn't feel distant at all. It feels like the earth itself is cracking, right at the edge of the place he's been calling behind the lines. Thomas isn't in the general's meetings. He doesn't hear about grand plans or careful alignments. What he hears are sudden orders. Units forming up, marching out, disappearing into the folds of ground between the town and the ridge. He watches lines of men move past warehouses and depots, past the still waiting locomotives, and head toward the slopes that have been staring down at them for weeks. From a street near the rail yard, he can't see the ridge clearly once the guns open up. Smoke hangs over the hills, torn by flashes. But he hears something he hasn't heard since before Chickamauga. A steady movement of sound, not just backward but forward. Shouting that isn't all panic, a roar that feels less like collapse and more like a push. Later, stories filter back faster than the wounded do. Men talk about charging up the ridge, about stumbling over works they were never supposed to reach, about flags suddenly appearing on the crest where no one thought they could be. In every version, the ridge line that held the town in a chokehold is now dotted with their own colors. Down in Chattanooga, the change is almost physical. Faces, which have been drawn tight for weeks, start to loosen. People stand a little taller when they walk past the depots and the riverfront. The rails and the water, which have felt like channels for desperation, suddenly look like roads opening outward again. For Thomas, it's not victory speeches that make the difference. It's what he sees and hears in the days after the guns fall mostly silent. Locomotives fired up and actually leaving, not just idling. Boats arriving heavy and leaving lighter. Wagons rolling out instead of only in. He climbs a rise at the edge of town and looks back the way he came months earlier. The tracks that once brought him into a question now stretch away from a town that has an answer. Chattanooga is still small, still crowded, still scarred, but it's no longer a trap, it's a base. Thomas doesn't know the names anyone will later give these fights. He knows only that the hills that once threatened to close around him have been pried open, and that the rails beneath his feet now point not just back to safety, but forward, deeper into a South that's running out of room to maneuver. Resaca, Kennesaw. Winter turns, and the war does what railroads do best. It starts moving again. How do you feed 100,000 men down a single steel thread? Chattanooga, once a question mark, has settled into its new role as a base. Tracks that used to feel like the edge of the world now look like the front of a long, narrow road heading south. When Thomas hears the orders, it feels almost familiar. Pack up. Form up. Get ready to move down the line. Only this time, nobody pretends they don't know where the rails lead. They've seen the names on the maps. Dalton, Resaca, Kennesaw, Atlanta. I'm on the Crescent now, riding the modern north-south main out of Atlanta that traces the old Western and Atlantic corridor. Thomas rode this same axis in 1864, just on different rails and in very different cars. Back in Chattanooga's yard, the Western and Atlantic is busy in a way Thomas hasn't seen since before Chickamauga. Engines shunt cars up and down the sidings, coupling long strings of freight and troop cars for the push into Georgia. The air smells of coal smoke and oil and something else. Anticipation, maybe, or the tired acceptance that the war has one more long ride in mind for him. When he climbs aboard again, it's like stepping into an old story with new lines. Same rough planks. Same crowded cars. Same mix of nerves and bravado. Men wedge themselves into corners and doorways, swap rumors about the strength of the defenses ahead, joke about who's going to get the worst of the cinders this time. As the train rolls out of Chattanooga, the town looks different to Thomas now. Not just a knot of streets and warehouses, but a machine bolted onto the rails and the river, built to feed the line he's riding. He knows that behind him, more trains will be forming, carloads of supplies, ammunition, and replacements following the same path. South of town, the scenery is familiar and altered at the same time. Cuts and fills he passed in 1863 have been widened, strengthened, scarred by earlier campaigns. Some bridges wear fresh timbers. Others are clearly new, reminders of raids and wrecks that tried and failed to silence this route. As my train glides south through North Georgia, past rivers and low ridges, I'm shadowing that 1864 push. Following the same rail spine Thomas rode as his war shifted from holding Chattanooga to driving on Atlanta. Men in the car talk about how the tracks cross the river here. How, if this spot falls, the whole advance could tangle and stall. To Thomas, it simplifies down to something he can see. Guns looking down on the bridge, men digging in on both sides of the track. Everyone acting like this stretch of rail is worth more than any field he's ever stood in. He feels the same mix of dread and inevitability he felt rolling toward Chickamauga. The railroad is doing what it always does, shrinking distance, piling men and material into tight, dangerous spaces faster than the countryside could ever manage on its own. Every mile they cover in hours by rail is another mile they might have to fight over on foot. As the train eases forward again, Thomas realizes he's riding not just into another battle, but into the second act of the same story. Chickamauga and Chattanooga taught him what happens when an army reaches for a rail hub and almost loses its grip. Now heading down the Western and Atlantic toward Resaca and the long road to Atlanta, he's about to find out what it feels like when an army decides it can't afford to let go of the line at all. Soon enough, the orders will come to climb down again, to trade the rhythm of the rails for the uneven ground of another battlefield. But for the moment, with the car swaying and the wheels hammering out their steady beat, Thomas does what he's done on every leg of this war. He watches the track ahead and wonders whether this is the ride that takes him home or just farther from it. By the time Thomas steps down near Resaca, he can tell this place was built around the track, not the other way around. The town is small, but the railroad cuts through it like a spine. Bridge over the river, sidings fanning out, a station and a few warehouses clinging close to the rails as if for safety. The first thing he notices is how everything important seems to face the line. Guns on the hills above are pointed not just at open fields, but at the curve where the track crosses the river. Fresh earthworks wrap around the approaches to the bridge, as if someone took a map and circled this spot in thick, shaking pencil. Resaca was a stop the train barely slowed for. Now it feels like the point the whole Western and Atlantic pivots on. Men talk about it that way in camp. If they hold here, we'll have to find another way. If we break them here, the road to Atlanta opens up. They never say road and mean the dirt paths. They mean the rails. Thomas feels the railroad under his boots even when he isn't standing on it. Orders are written around it. Hold this ridge because it overlooks the bridge. Dig in along this line because it shields the track. Keep the enemy from getting their guns where they can hit the trains. The battlefield doesn't radiate out from a crossroads or a farmhouse. It curls around the iron. When the fighting starts, he realizes Resaca sounds different from Chickamauga. There's the same crack and roar of rifles and artillery, but underneath it is the pulse of the railroad. Engines huffing in the distance, whistles cutting through the gunfire, the metallic clatter of cars being shunted even while shells burst on the hills. At one point in the afternoon, as he lies behind a shallow rise scratching at the dirt with his fingers, Thomas feels the ground tremble. For a heartbeat, he thinks it's just another cannon blast, but then the vibration settles into something steadier, the thud of wheels over joints. Somewhere behind their lines, a train is moving, inching past the edge of danger to bring up ammunition or take wounded away. Men around him mark time by that sound. Still running. Someone mutters after another whistle. Then we're not done yet. Nobody says it out loud, but Thomas understands. As long as trains are coming and going, this line is alive, and so is their chance to stay here. When a shell lands close to the tracks, sending a geyser of earth and splinters into the air, every head turns the same way. For a moment, the rifles fall quieter, not out of fear of the enemy, but out of fear for the rails. If the bridge goes, if the track twists and buckles, the battle changes from hold this ground to find a way out. From his position, Thomas can see glimpses of the bridge through the smoke, a pale streak of timber and iron over the brown water. Men are clustered at both ends. Some firing, some digging, some just watching. It isn't pretty or heroic. It looks like people trying to hang onto a door in a flood. Late in the day, when orders finally send his unit shifting along the line, he has to cross near the tracks. Up close, the ties are scarred with fresh marks. Chips from shell fragments, gouges from hastily driven spikes, dark stains that aren't all from oil. He realizes this railroad has taken hits just like the men have, and that both are somehow still functioning. As he scrambles up the far slope, lungs burning, he glances back and sees a locomotive easing forward, black against the haze, edging onto the bridge as if testing whether the day's punishment has broken anything vital. Behind it, low freight cars wait like open hands, for crates, for wounded, for whatever this fight decides to hand them. Resaca, to Thomas, isn't just another battle in another field. It's a day spent defending a very specific piece of the war's machinery, a bridge, a curve of track, a thread of iron over water. When night finally comes and the guns fall mostly silent, he doesn't remember the exact shape of the enemy's lines. He remembers the way everyone, officers, engineers, infantry, teamsters kept glancing toward the railroad, as if checking that the heart was still beating. He lies down at last within earshot of the tracks. Somewhere in the dark, an engine gives a tired whistle and starts to move. The sound rolls over him like a slow exhale. As long as the trains are still running here, he thinks Resaca belongs to them, at least for now. When Thomas first sees Kennesaw Mountain, it doesn't look like a place anyone would choose to fight. It looks like the kind of hill you walk around, not over. A long dark shape looming above the trees with its shoulders bristling where men have already started to dig in. As he gets closer, he realizes the trenches and gun pits aren't just thrown anywhere on those slopes. They trace a rough arc that shields something lower down. Roads, wagon parks, and, always, the railroad. The Western and Atlantic runs just beyond the mountain, close enough that you can hear the distant clatter of trains even when the guns are quiet. In camp, nobody bothers pretending the mountain is the real prize. Men talk about Sherman's lifeline with a kind of grim respect. They know his army has clung to that track all the way from Chattanooga, and that every fort, every flank, every bloody field has been chosen to keep that iron road in working order. From where Thomas stands, the rail line is mostly hidden, just occasional glimpses of right-of-way through gaps in the trees, the faint gleam of iron when the light hits just right. But the way officers point, the way maps are unfolded and folded again, makes it clear. The trenches on Kennesaw exist because the railroad does. When the assault comes, the ground in front of him feels all wrong. It rises too steeply, funneling him and the men beside him into angles chosen long ago by whoever picked this hill to defend. Trees and rocks that would be cover anywhere else are just waypoints on a climb that never seems to end. Musket fire and artillery turn the slopes into a killing zone. Thomas scrambles upward, slipping on loose dirt, grabbing at roots, feeling bullets smack into trunks and stones inches away. Every time he dives behind a stump or log, he's aware that the men above him can afford to wait and reload. Gravity is on their side. There's a moment halfway up, when he flattens himself in a shallow dip and hears a sound that doesn't belong to the battle. A low rhythmic thunder from behind the lines. For a second he thinks it's more guns. Then he realizes it's a train, somewhere out of sight, rolling along the Western and Atlantic, carrying food and shells and reinforcements past this mountain that everyone is bleeding over. That sound hits him harder than the shells do. It drives home why no one is walking away from Kennesaw without a fight. The mountain isn't just high ground. It's a shield. If it falls, the line behind it is suddenly naked, a steel spine exposed to anyone with explosives and a little nerve. All along the slope, the attack falters. Units veer off course in the smoke. Men hug the ground and refuse to move into fire that feels suicidal. Some pockets push almost to the enemy works, see the muzzles and the faces above the parapets, and realize there's no way to go forward without leaving most of their friends on the hillside. By late in the day, Thomas finds himself pinned in a shallow scrape, the summit still out of reach. The air is thick with powder and the sweet sour reek of blood. He can't see the railroad, but he knows it's still there, stretching past the base of this mountain like a dare. He hears the order to pull back passed along in fragments, more by movement than by voice. Men begin to edge downhill, then stumble, then run, trying to keep some kind of formation even as they trip over roots and the fallen. It feels like the mountain is spitting them out, refusing to be taken on those turns. At the bottom, gasping, Thomas looks back. Kennesaw looms exactly as it did that morning, unchanged, except for the thin smears of smoke and the knowledge of what's now lying on its slopes. He realizes you can lose a battle without losing the thing you're really fighting for. Because as battered as they are, the trains are still running. Somewhere behind the lines, locomotives are taking water and coal. Freight cars are being loaded and unloaded, and the Western and Atlantic is still doing its job. Kennesaw has held, but so has the rail line twisting past it. For Thomas, that's the shape of this fight. Not a clean victory or defeat, but another proof that out here, hills and towns only matter because of what they mean for the tracks under his feet. The mountain will stay in his memory as a place of steep ground and stubborn defenders. But the reason it mattered will always be the railroad humming just out of sight. Into Atlanta. What does it look like when you cut the rails out from under a whole city? By the time Thomas's train starts seeing Atlanta on the schedule boards, the name doesn't just mean a city. It means the end of a long, narrow steel road that has been feeding an army all the way from Chattanooga. Atlanta is not a quiet junction like Resaca or a deep cut like Allatoona. It's a full-blown rail machine, a knot of depots, roundhouses, and switching yards where four big lines meet. The Western and Atlantic from the north, the Macon and Western from the south, the Atlanta and West Point from the west, and the Georgia Railroad from the east. From the window of the car, Thomas sees smoke from different directions all pouring into the same low bowl of buildings and tracks. When his train finally crawls the last miles in, it feels less like entering a city and more like merging into a river made of iron. Rails split and rejoin. Sidings curl off and vanish behind warehouses, and locomotives sit nose to nose on turntables, waiting their turn to drag more cars in or out. Everywhere he looks, something is moving. Coal being shoveled, cars being coupled, stacks of crates and barrels sliding along planks toward different sheds. Atlanta has been a Confederate lifeline for years, shipping food, ammunition, and uniforms out along these lines to armies in Tennessee, Alabama, and Virginia. Now, in 1864, the direction has started to flip. As Sherman's men tighten around the city, the same rails that once fed Confederate armies are being watched, probed, and slowly cut one line at a time. Thomas doesn't see the whole summer's chess game. He doesn't follow the maps that show blue arrows swinging around the north and west of the city, or the raids sent to tear up track miles away. What he sees are the effects. Trains that used to arrive on a regular pulse now show up late, half empty, or not at all. Inside the city, the siege creeps in by degrees. At first, the yards still feel busy, almost normal, just crowded with more uniforms and fewer civilians. Then the gaps start to show. Piles of rails wait to repair lines that keep getting cut. Wagons rumble in from broken stretches of track south and east. Loads that should have come by rail drag the last miles by mules. Artillery changes the rhythm. One day, Thomas is helping shift ammunition in a yard when the first shells arc in from the north and east, plunging into the city like iron hail. The ground shakes. Glass shatters in depot windows. And suddenly the open spaces between tracks feel less like work yards and more like targets. After that, Atlanta stops being just a hub and becomes a hollow, a bowl being shelled from the rim. Men dig rifle pits and batteries on the edges of town. Guns sighted not just on approaching infantry, but on any place where the rails run close enough to be hit. Between bombardments, trains still try to move, darting in at night, slipping out under cover of smoke and darkness. Atlanta's streets only underline how much the city and the railroad have fused. Workshops hammer out shoes, wagons, and artillery parts. Depots brim with hardtack, forage, and ammunition. Warehouses serve as both storehouses and bivouacs. Every building that can be turned into a piece of the supply chain has been, and every one of them depends on rails to matter. For Thomas, the battles around the city blur together. He hears names: Peachtree Creek, the July 22nd attack, Ezra Church, but on the ground the pattern feels familiar. Confederate forces lunging out from the ring of works, trying to smash a flank or rip up track. Union lines bending but not breaking, then inching closer to the railroads feeding the city. Each time the fighting subsides, rumor runs along the trenches about another line cut, another depot hit, another piece of the rail web snapped. The real turning point, as far as Thomas can feel it, comes when talk shifts from attacks on the city to attacks on the rails behind it. He hears that columns have swung south and west, aiming not at the downtown depots, but at the last railroads still keeping Atlanta alive, the Macon and Western and the lines toward West Point. When word filters back that those tracks have been seized and torn up near Jonesboro, the mood in the defenses changes. You can't see a railroad cut from every trench. But you can feel it. Supply trains stop arriving. Rations, already tight, thin out. Men start counting not just cartridges but days, trying to guess how long a city can fight when its iron lifelines south have been severed. One night, the pattern breaks. Instead of the usual rumble of trains trying to run the gauntlet, Thomas hears a different kind of movement. Wagons creaking out of town. Shouted orders muffled instead of sharp. The strange, hollow quiet that comes when a city is being emptied, not reinforced. Hood's army is slipping away, pulling out before they can be trapped in a place whose rails no longer lead to safety. When Thomas walks into the rail yards the next morning, Atlanta feels like a gigantic workshop that someone has walked out of mid-shift. Tools lie where they were dropped. Cars stand half-loaded. Coal piles sit untouched. On some tracks, locomotives are already being prepared for a different job. Not hauling supplies, but dragging out anything that can be salvaged before the rest is destroyed. He watches as crews start their own kind of demolition. Rails are lifted, bent, and twisted into what men start calling Sherman's neckties. Looped around trees are left cooling in grotesque spirals. Ties are stacked and burned, depots and workshops stripped of anything useful, then set alight. The iron web that made Atlanta a prize is being turned into scrap so no army can use it again soon. The fire, when it finally takes hold, doesn't feel like a single blaze. It's dozens of smaller infernos, warehouses, factories, and sheds, each one sending its own column of smoke into the sky. From a slight rise near the Western and Atlantic tracks, Thomas can see the city flicker. The glare of burning buildings, the dull red glow of crosties catching, the silhouettes of chimneys and water tanks against the light. He knows, vaguely, that this is more than just another local victory. He's heard officers talk about how taking Atlanta will echo all the way to Washington, about how a rail hub falling here might mean an election decided somewhere else. But standing by the tracks, what he feels is simpler. The sense that one of the biggest engines of the Confederate war effort has just ground to a halt. For Thomas, the rails have always been the measure of the war. At Chattanooga, they turned a small river town into a crossroads worth starving and fighting for. At Chickamauga, they brought in more men than the woods could hold. Along the Western and Atlantic, they turned dots on a map, Resaca, Kennesaw, into places where the line itself was under fire. In Atlanta, he's finally seeing what happens when an entire rail nexus is fought over, cut apart, and then deliberately broken so the war can move on without it. A few days later, as he moves past the ruined yards, Thomas hears talk of the next phase of marching away from the rails entirely, cutting loose from the long supply line that brought him here. To him, that sounds almost impossible. For 2 years, the railroad has been the spine of his world, the thing that made these vast movements and sieges possible. Now, with Atlanta burning behind him and twisted iron cooling by the tracks, he realizes the war is about to step off the rails and try to keep going anyway. My Crescent eases south. The landscape outside my window stops being Civil War country and goes back to being just home for a lot of people. Subdivisions, warehouses, church roofs, little downtowns tucked along the tracks. Thomas never saw any of that. For him, this same corridor was a chain of emergencies. Chattanooga, Chickamauga, Resaca, Kennesaw, Atlanta. Each one another test of whether the rails would keep moving or finally break. He spent his war measuring distance in sidings and depots, in bridges that might blow and cuts that might fill with rock and men. Every time he climbed into a car, he didn't know if the ride ahead would be a few quiet hours or the last comfortable boards he'd ever stand on. For him, the Western and Atlantic wasn't a route on a timetable. It was a lifeline he could feel under his boots. I'm sitting in a padded seat, watching the same hills and rivers slide past, with the luxury of knowing where my train will stop and roughly when. The biggest question on my mind is whether I'll make a connection, not whether there will be food at the end of the line. But the shape of Thomas's journey is still here if you know how to look for it. Cuts where rock was blasted, towns that grew up around junctions, ridges that once decided who ate and who went hungry. When my train slows for a signal or eases over a bridge, I think about the times Thomas listened for the same sounds with a very different kind of hope. A whistle to him might mean evacuation or resupply or nothing at all, if the line had been cut somewhere out of sight. He learned that in this part of the country, the war and the railroad were the same conversation, spoken in steam and iron. As we roll into the city, rails spread and merge under us, threading into yards and terminals Thomas would barely recognize. The Western and Atlantic has changed names and owners. The locomotives are bigger, the cars longer, the cargo different. But the basic truth is the same. Whoever controls the rails here still controls how people and things move through this landscape. Thomas's story doesn't have a neat final station. Thomas doesn't know what comes after Atlanta. He doesn't see the telegrams, the headlines, the election back in the north that this burning rail hub will help decide. For him, the war is still measured in miles of track, nights on hard benches, and the distance between one set of depot lamps and the next. I do know what comes next. From here, Sherman is going to do something that would have sounded impossible to Thomas back in 1863. He's going to step off the railroad entirely. With Atlanta's depots wrecked and its rails twisted into neckties, the Western and Atlantic has done its job. And the Army is about to prove it can live off the land instead of off the timetable. As my Crescent glides the last few miles into modern Atlanta, none of that is visible out the window. These rails look clean, orderly, almost inevitable. Signals blink green and red. Freight trains wait in tidy sidings. Passengers check their phones instead of maps. But once you've ridden this line with Thomas in mind, it's hard to unsee the older story hiding under the ballast. Every smooth curve south of Chattanooga was once a military problem. Every quiet siding was once a potential choke point where an army might starve or escape, depending on which trains got through and which didn't. Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Resaca, Kennesaw, Atlanta. On the modern timetable, they're just station names and junctions. In the 1860s, they were tests of what happened when a 19th century war hit 19th century speed. Rails didn't make the Civil War. They magnified it, turning river towns into crossroads, crossroads into prizes, and prizes into ruins when the iron finally gave way. By the time my train rolls under the lights of Atlanta's station, Thomas's war is long over. The cut at Resaca is quiet. The woods at Chickamauga are a park. The roundhouses and depots that once fed an army are memory and brickwork and interpretive signs. The rails, though, are still doing what they've always done, pulling places together that would otherwise feel very far apart. For Thomas, that meant being carried into battles he didn't choose, at a speed his grandparents could barely imagine. For me, and for you, if you ever ride this line, it means having a few extra hours to sit by a window and think about how much of our world was built at the speed of steam. From here, the story of this railroad doesn't end. It just changes. South of Atlanta, the old routes fade into other lines and other wars and other kinds of traffic. If you want to keep following them, we can. But for this trip, this episode, this ride with Thomas, this is where we step off at a city the railroad made, and then, once upon a time, helped unmake. I'm keen on the rails. And I'll see you on the next train from history.